So I'm now doing video 7, and the previous video was the beginning of Bob Spangler's notes and notes from some others who were present in the Friday afternoon meeting at Glacier View. And I'm reading them out to you. I'm about halfway through, so there's a bit to go. They wouldn't have covered everything. As I mentioned before, I remember things that happened that aren't recorded. But I feel it's fair to tell you what the other side was saying, because I'm so biased about Des. But, you know, they had a viewpoint, and you need to see that they weren't terrible people. I don't really think they understood everything that was going on, but they were trying to be loyal to the church. And of course, they believed all this stuff that John Brinsmead had said. And Des was very kind when they asked him questions about Bob Brinsmead. You know, he felt that he was a gospel minister and that he should not be disloyal to him because of this. But if you know Des is very kind to almost everybody. And he always talks about these wonderful Christian men who don't know a lot about theology. So anyway, I'm continuing with these notes, and this is the notes of Pastor Duffy. Lovely man. Duffy: Des, I have a question about this gadfly philosophy that you mentioned. You said that Ballinger was a gadfly sent to sting a complacent church into reassessment of its beliefs. Is this how you see yourself? Ford: The church has been delinquent in the past, more than 100 years now, because of unsound views of inspiration. This is what must be corrected. Indeed, prophets make mistakes. Ellen White was mistaken in many things. The pioneers were wrong in many things. Church leaders have failed to face up to these wrongs. Duffy: Do you think that censure and blame against church leaders or the church is the way to correct wrongs or wrong views? Ellen White says censure and blame rarely win a soul from a wrong position. What do you suppose your methods will produce? I must say Ellen White did a bit of censure and blaming herself. Ford: Well, yes, I realise what Ellen White says. You're quite right. But don't you think that the leaders were negligent and dilatory back then? Duffy said, no, they did the best they could. Perhaps you have no idea of what they went through. But Des, I'm concerned about the main propositions that you're putting to us to correct supposed wrong views. Am I right in what I see you wanting the church to do? 1, drop the investigative judgment. 2, drop the 2,300 days and the cleansing of the sanctuary in 1844. You're saying these are only the swaddling clothes in which the baby came. Cast them off, and we'll grow up and go forward with rejoicing. Is this what you're proposing? Des: Yes, I agree with you. Arthur, this would be hard to accept. The church needs to change its view of inspiration regarding the sanctuary. Duffy: Your paper sees Ellen White's role as merely that of a pastor, and you deal only with her didactic passages on the cleansing of the sanctuary. You say that they were copied from Uriah Smith. I want to ask you why you said nothing at all about her prophetic statements regarding the sanctuary. Did she not say that the Lord showed her that the sanctuary truth as they had held it for the past 50 years was the truth? 2, did she not warn the church about departing from it? Did she not say in the future there would be a departing from the truth, especially on the sanctuary question? These were prophetic statements. How do you rationalise that? Why did you not deal with these bottom-line questions in your paper? Can you not see that the church cannot ignore the prophet? to accept your propositions. Ford: Yes, Arthur, it's true that I did not deal with these aspects in my paper. Do you realise the context in which they were written? Ellen White saw the danger of the real truths of the sanctuary being lost, the real truth into which the church would grow, that in focusing on a mere building in heaven, the truth of the gospel would be lost from their hearts. Des, said Duffy, that is not the context. That is not what the statements say, is it? Ford: Ellen White changed her own views on the sanctuary, didn't she? What about the shut door? We should be prepared to change for a better position. Duffy: There were changes of views in those days of a minor nature, but these umbrella statements say the sanctuary doctrine must not change. That which the Lord had been teaching them for the last 50 years on the sanctuary must not be given up. Am I correct on this, brethren? Isn't this what Ellen White was saying to us? Eva: Yes. Gospel Workers 302 is one, I think. Duffy: Why not yield these negative positions which deny the prophetic counsels given in the spirit of prophecy? And here Arthur has written, I cannot recall Des's reply. Following Duffy, I believe Ralph Thompson spoke, and his comments follow. Thompson: Questions to Des. Are you aware that there are a number of young workers who were trained by you at Avondale who say if Des Ford leaves the Adventist Church, I will leave? Des said, I don't plan to leave the Adventist Church. I may leave the ministry of the Adventist Church, but not the church. Yes, Gill and I are aware there is this feeling among some of the young workers, and it makes us sad. That is why I'm willing to write a statement for the Adventist Review and the Australasian Record, enjoining them not to do so. Thompson: At what point does an individual minister have the right to challenge publicly the teachings of the church? Des: This has been done by several in articles in the ministry and SDA commentary. Many have presented views that are not in harmony with the general belief of the church in some areas. I didn't want to say on the floor anything to embarrass the leadership of the Australasian Division. When you said that Pastor Sibley gave you the okay to teach a variant view on our fundamentalist beliefs to the students in your classes, how could a local conference president give such permission when the college is a divine institution? No such authority was given the college board and the division committee. Des said, Pastor Sibley was my mentor and personal friend with whom I counselled constantly. However, I taught the traditional view, but I raised the questions that they would meet out in the field. I tried to prepare them for this encounter by raising the problems that would confront them, but I did teach the traditional view. I'm sorry if I was misunderstood on this point. I am not certain, but I believe that W.D. Eva spoke next. W.D. Eva to Des. You've been a help and a blessing to many as you've emphasised the blessings of God's free grace, but you've been greatly misunderstood by others and many have been confused. We must be concerned for them because all are God's children. Some feel your views as expressed strengthen the strains being brought upon the church by those whose purpose appears to be to split it. Because the church is thus menaced, you and I must be concerned. For the sake of the sheep, for the sake of the acceptance of truth and the strengthening of the church, we need to move slowly enough so that all the church can keep up with us. In World War II, the speed of transatlantic and other convoys was no faster than that of the slowest ship. The recent history of my native land, South Africa, demonstrates what can happen when some try to move too fast. After World War II, General Jan Smuts, South Africa's Prime Minister, began to shape a forward-looking policy for all of South Africa. The opposition played on the fears of the white electorate, and for 32 years it has ruled the country with retrogressive policies. And fears of the white electorate, and for 32 years it has ruled the country with retrogressive politics and brought the country to the place where the peaceful settlement of its problems is almost impossible. What might have happened had Smuts, now this is not our Smuts, been prepared to move a little slower? Is there a lesson for us here? I can understand what your reactions might have been to the letter read yesterday, reference to R.H. Pearson's letter written in by R.S., and to one of the speeches made. But we must accept each other as we are and make the allowances necessary to preserve our unity. We must do all we can to maintain confidence in our leaders. It is sometimes possible, in the way we might follow a good course, to cause disunity or shake the faith of people in the truth and the Church's leaders. Is it not possible for you to speak out on unity? Here Ford replies in the affirmative, but said he would have to teach also that unity is not uniformity. Yes, that's true, we do not want uniformity, but our hearts must ever be with the sheep and the effect a too rapid movement might have on them. You might not speak out on Brinsmead by name, but in speaking for the unity of the Church and acting to preserve it, it can be known where you stand and that you are not with those with whom you are identified. I wish also that you could have kept a lower profile in this matter. Your intense earnestness in regard to your conviction leads to your being identified with them. Thus, instead of being able to deal with an issue, we find ourselves having to deal with you. This too leads to confusion and much restlessness and unhappiness in the flock. For the sake of souls brought with the blood of Christ, we must keep things less intense. Please come with us, Des. For the sake of the Church and its people, for your own sake, your ministry is of great value to the Church. Don't you just love that man? We did. At this point, if my recollection is correct, the chairman, Pastor Wilson, said at this point there is no agreement. Wernick was followed by a question, how can you help us with the fallout? Ford replied, I understand the delicacy of your situation. I'm willing to write an article for the Review and Herald. I'm sorry to have caused you so much trouble. You've done the right thing and I don't blame you. I'm not sure just when a handwritten letter by Parmenter was read to Des Ford. Parmenter stated that this was tentative. He wanted Des to know what procedure he was following. The idea was that Parmenter was going back to Australia, recommend to the Division Committee and College Board that a letter be given to Des Ford, and any action taken would naturally depend on Ford's response. After Parmenter read the letter to Ford, he was asked to think about it, not give a decision immediately. Parmenter made a strong appeal to Ford to take the counsel of the brethren, to take time to think and pray about the matter. He stated that we did not expect or require an answer now. Parmenter made statements to the effect that he, Ford and his family were assured that their financial needs would be cared for in the immediate future, as well as their transportation back to Australia, in the event he was not willing to accept the counsel of the brethren. The attached letter is, as I understand it, a slightly modified form of the one read to Ford. Here is a letter from Keith Parmenter, not the original version, which is not available to me, but a modified one, which appeared in the Ministry magazine October 1980. Because it's difficult to read, I've copied it out of the Ministry magazine and pasted it in here. you can go to the ministry magazine and find this. It's called Parmenter Forward Correspondence, and this is in the ministry magazine September 1980, and you will find it in the Spectrum archives, and you can download it and read it. Following the reading of the letter, and after a strong appeal by both pastors, Parmenter and Wilson, that it was not necessary to give a decision today, but to pray about the matter and think it through carefully, Ford responded immediately. Now, these notes, you'll remember last time that I talked about it, that Parmenter made it very clear that Des had to state in the review that he had changed his mind. He could not shelve his views. He had to state that he'd changed his mind in order to retain his job. And he also had to put a statement in about Bob Brinsmead distancing himself from it. And Des would not do this because Bob was a fellow gospel preacher at that time, and this was very hard for the brethren to understand. And of course, when he did that, and when he was happy about these supposed 50,000 tapes that had gone out, which really hadn't, because it wasn't true, I guess the brethren thought that what John Brinsmead had said was true. People get to the top in politics and also in the church, even if they're very good men, by being very wise politically. And so it was hard for those men to understand that Des would not distance himself from Bob Brinsmead. But Des did not collude with Bob. So they report Des as saying, "I must be true to my conscience. I cannot lie. My wife and I do not need any time to think over our response to this letter read to us. You have made it easy for me to answer. I cannot conscientiously agree to your request. I regret the trouble I brought to you. I'm very sorry for that. Our friendship is not lightly sundered. I will do what I can to prevent a rupture. I understand what you've written, but I cannot accept this." Wilson said, "How far can you go?" Ford said, "I believe I can still be a blessing to this church. I will never be a blessing if I go against my conscience. I'm sorry I've caused so much trouble. I'll write an article for the Review and Herald. You've done the right thing, and I don't blame you for what you're doing." You know, I don't think Des intentionally caused a lot of trouble. Had a huge vendetta against him, which they never ever mentioned. I understand a little bit about, just a tiny bit about how Princess Di felt with all the photojournalists, because there were people after Des, and really friends of Des who really know him, know what his heart was like. And Neil Wilson wrote in the ministry magazine that Des behaved like a Christian gentleman, and he always does, but he could not agree to what they asked him to do, because really they were rebooting the 10-point statement. And again, I mentioned that the consensus statements, which had all the beliefs of all the people there, and basically bypassed that. Now, Des could have agreed to the consensus, but it seems that the brethren didn't really realise. Now, I may be wrong with that, but that's the impression that I got. They did not realise that the Glacier View consensus made a huge advance on a number of points. Some of it probably was traditional, but some of it was much more advanced, as Norman says. But that wasn't the issue in the Friday afternoon meeting. They used that statement where Des differed from the traditional viewpoint, not the version of the consensus. And of course Des differed. And I said to you before that Norm Young and even Arthur Furch would not have been able to agree with a 10-point statement. Possibly not even the French man, whose name I forget, who was at Andrews, who was on the committee of 6. At this point, Ford's wife Okay, sorry, I missed a bit there. He said, then your statements are more than tentative. Ford said, the brethren have made tremendous progress these last few days. Your position is closer to mine than ever before. If we've come this far in 4 days, can you imagine how far we will go in 4 years? I don't think they would have liked that. Wilson said, the statements made by some in the meetings are not necessarily the position of the church. And Ford said, I can support the consensus statement in essence. At this point, Ford's wife, Gill, who'd been crying, I might add, had been crying for 3.5 hours, gained her composure and asked for permission to make a few remarks. Gill, handwritten note by Spangler. We have felt the friendship and love of everyone. Everyone has been very fair. But I feel that Des was prejudged. I feel that Elder Wilson's first speech stated that we must come to consensus during this meeting, set the pattern for the discussion. He also spoke about the Review and Herald in a supportive way. He stated that the Review and Herald is a church paper and has a right to support the doctrinal position which the church has taken. In fact, it's their duty and responsibility. But to say this prejudged the entire case, since the Review had taken a position against Des. The impression was given that we must stand by that position and come to that conclusion by the end of the week. This is still Gill. I felt that on Thursday there could have been a breakthrough. Handwritten sentence by Spangler, she was probably referring to Provencher's speech. Had not Dr. Heppenstall on Tuesday made an emotional appeal to Des which set the atmosphere for dramatic exchange between them, between Pastor Wilson and Des. Then the letter of R.H. Pearson, which was read to the group, also damaged the case, put Des in the worst light possible. The appeal by Pastor Blem didn't help the situation. Gill then referred to the reactions against Brinsmead and that those who felt this way had unfairly prejudged Des. Handwritten note by Spangler, she referred to the thousands that had been blessed by Des's ministry. She stated that Des had been misrepresented in tapes and articles. She specifically said that there was no association with the Brinsmeads except in 1 or 2 phone calls. At this point, Des said that he'd spoken on the telephone with Bob Brinsmead only twice in the past year and that he'd been trying to find some answer to these problems. Gill continued by saying that Des is not throwing out Ellen White. She spoke again of the emotional tone of the meeting. She then went into individuals who'd said they would step down. She specifically mentioned Fred Veltman. She spoke of scholars on Des' side and mentioned Londas and Zamora. Handwritten note at bottom of the page by R.S. At this point, Wilson and Parmenter stated it was difficult to know as these same scholars came to them and said the opposite. She referred to other individuals such as Ralph Larson and the Standish brothers who had maliciously and unfairly attacked Des. She referred to Larson making a trip to Australia and speaking against Des. Both Wilson and Parmenter pointed out that Larson had gone to Australia on his own. He'd been reprimanded for doing so. Then Gill referred to problems with Ellen White, made reference to Beatrice Neal's questions on the trumpets in great controversy which she could no longer teach in her classes. She said that Des had tried to solve this problem, but so far unsuccessfully. Ford at this juncture said that the major issue is how we understand stand as inspiration. Again, Gill remarked about the malicious opposition against Des and spoke of Irwin Gaines' changed attitude towards Des at the Glacier View meeting and said that Gaines apologised to Des and they shook hands. In all of this, Gill says, Des has never retaliated. He's always making excuses for people. I also remember, and it's not in here, that I mentioned Gerhard Hasel, and I told the brethren, he tells you what you want to hear. I'm not certain where Ford made the following statement. I think that's what I said. That seems to be the end, and I'm glad he wrote it down because I don't remember. But as I told you, I'm very proud that I spoke up because I was crying my eyes out, but I thought I'm going to say something anyway. Ford referred to the fact that a student could go through the seminary and never hear about 1844 and the investigative judgment in the heavenly sanctuary. He referred to one of the 3 small committee meetings where he asked, "Brethren, when was the last time that you ever heard a sermon on the sanctuary? Have any of you heard one in the last several years?" Only one person raised his hand, and that was Gerhard Damstedt, and I asked him if he was the one who preached it himself, and he said yes. Ford expanded this indictment on the entire sanctuary business, which will cost me my credentials. However, I've made a contribution to the church, which has opened up this whole area for discussion and needs to be brought to light. Then at this point, I'm not certain who spoke next, but I do remember my remarks to Des. Des, we've spent some 50 hours with you in committee meetings, and after discussing your first draft of your paper, pointing out what we considered needed changes, and yet in your final document you did not move on one pinpoint. Not one pinpoint did you change in. Well, I did make some changes, for in council with Bill Johnson, I toned down some of the language about individuals. Now what Bob Spangler is speaking about here is the pre-Glacier View meetings where they had committees under Pastor Hamill. And Des said if very few people spoke, and there are actually very few papers. Jim Cox wrote a paper supporting Des and said, I think he said, I better not say because I can't remember, but anyway, Bill Johnson wrote a paper. Gerhard Damstedt said the most, but Des said he knew the least to me. He wouldn't say that to anybody else. And Des has always felt that if those tapes came out, they would exonerate him because what the brethren said was very thin. And some things that Dr. Hamill said were amazing. But anyway, you have to find those tapes. I don't know whether you can get hold of them, but they should be in archives. Des said in order to change, he needed evidence and he didn't feel that he was given it. And, you know, you may not like Des's personality. You may think he's too confident. There's lots of us who don't think this, but, you know, we're grateful for somebody who treats lay people as intelligent and speaks the truth instead of pushing everything under the rug. I should say to you that there are several books coming out. One is a book on the investigative judgment, an anonymous book because the person is still in the work. Arthur Patrick was his front cover to deal with people. This person who's writing the book, that will be out within weeks. This is now August 2017. Another book which I'm hoping will come out is a biography of Ray Cottrell with Doug Hackelman. It's a biography of not only Cottrell but also particularly his grandfather who worked with Ellen White and Uriah Smith. and it will have material in it from Glacier View. And Des and I both read the manuscript and hope that Doug will finish it, because he's still working and he's a busy man. But when you read that book, you see how they've always been traditionalists in the church who have hindered progress and keep rebooting and going back to the original Adventism. And there's always been progressives. Ray Cottrell was one. And those people have always been under fire, and the church has always tried to stop progress. And you're going to see, I'm now digressing from my notes. I'm on page 12, so I've only got another page. But Des was just the latest one in the line. And to some degree, Doug Hackelman's book will be a bombshell, and it will exonerate Ray and Des and their ilk. They were not on their own. Des has said to me that he sees himself, because he's had some experiences with health problems, had a mild stroke after having his teeth out, and then he had a massive jaw infection in 2015 and 16 when he nearly died. And the Lord has restored him. He's still preaching and his mind is as good as ever. But he said death is a natural process. Everybody has their work and they lay it down. He said, I have continued Fletcher's work. And he said, I don't know who is going to take my work up. So that's said by somebody who very much loves the Adventist Church. If they asked us to go back in, we would not. We do attend church. Go to hear a gospel minister in a church that embodies loving God and loving their fellow man. So we feel very comfortable there. But the church has not really changed on some of these things. There's still this mix-up, many forms of Adventism, and the gospel of righteousness by faith and the traditional view are only two. There are other more liberal views down at Loma Linda. So there's a lot of different views, but there's still problems going on with the church, and I've gone off. I must finish this. So you'll excuse me. So at this point, both Wilson and Spangler replied that this had nothing to do with his theological posture, but rather points dealing with his personality. Pastor Parmenter went back to his letter and restated some of the items at this juncture. And Des said, I realise that in your position you've got to do this. If we do what our conscience tells us to do, I'll be glad to put a statement in the Review and Herald telling people not to follow me. But that never happened. They didn't ask him. I'll feel no bitterness. I'll make no complaint. I'll never be angry. I know what I'd do if I were in your place, and I will not feel angry about it. So, to give them their credit, they put this in the notes. And this is probably why Neil Wilson said Des acted like a Christian gentleman, which he is. Appeals by nearly everyone in the committee requested Des not to make a decision at that point. And despite the mention of, we'll give you time, it was very, very clear that Des could do no other, because Parmenter expected him to completely change his mind and state that he'd done so, and he must distance himself with Bob Brinsmead. Des didn't agree with everything that Bob taught. Nobody agrees. He didn't like the way the Brinsmeads their modus operandi. But he would not speak out against Bob, and that went against him. Gill was weeping, and eventually both of them asked the brethren not to make any more appeals because the decision had been made. Finally, Ralph Thompson raised his hand, and brethren, I think we've pressured them enough, and they must make their own decision. Following this, a few remarks were made by the chairman, who called on Spangler to offer the benediction as we stood around the table. It was a most tense, dramatic and emotional moment. After the prayer, Des went around shaking hands with each individual. Tears were shed by several. So here's my notes. Many of these I typed out from the original. Some of them were already typed. Bob Spangler's handwritten notes and notes by others, and this was all used to write up part of the ministry magazine in September 1980. And if you want a copy of these notes, you ought to be able to get them from GC Archives. So that's the story, and Des and I were together on this, and I haven't planned to say any more at this point. We really never lost a friend, and people have been wonderful to us. One or two people have upset me in the past over their response to Glacier View and their attitude towards Des, but very few. And as I said to you at the beginning when I started doing these, people have their own little world, and people think differently, and that's okay. It would have hurt a lot of scholars who were more advanced. It would have put them in a very difficult situation after Glacier View. They had to face the fallout. All right for Des to say, I've had enough, I'm ready, I've got nothing to lose when I go to Glacier View, but a lot of other people did. And they loved the church, wanted to stay in it. Des was able to take part in another organisation, and Des actually has good business instincts, and not everybody could have done what he did. So again, thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry if I got long-winded, but anyway, if you find it of use, I'm glad. God bless you.